used is as a corroborative element to assist the tribunal or the court in reaching a conclusion that normally arrives to by relying on other evidence, such as documents, treaties, or subsequent practice between states. And for example, in the Pedra Branca Pulau Batu Putih, sorry, between Malaysia and Singapore, Malaysia submitted around 80 maps to the court. Well, Singapore as well, but the court paid special attention to the fact that Malaysia starts publishing official maps considering the maritime feature Pedra Branca as being within its territory, quite behind Singapore. I think Malaysia started publishing in 1962, which is the map you see in your left side screen. And Singapore started publishing a couple of decades later. Therefore, the court used the map coupled to other sources of evidence, as Arif will comment on afterwards, to determine that Pedra Branca was within Malaysian sovereignty. Now, turning to maritime delimitation disputes, the question is a bit different, because then these disputes parties normally are trying to convince the court that the maritime delimitation line they are proposing is the most equitable solution for the dispute. And here the maps are normally used to assist in justifying why the course of this maritime line, and at least in two ways. For example, it can a map can help to elucidate where there is an already agreed maritime delimitation boundary, as happened in the case between Peru and Chile in 2014, where the court considered a previous delimitation line and start drawing its delimitation line after this agreed boundary. A second example in which maps and photos have been proved to be determinant is elucidating the legal nature of maritime features. That is to say, whether we are dealing with an island or with a low tide elevation or with artificial islands, and therefore the consequences portrayed under the law of the sea, which ultimately will modify the maritime delimitation line, as happened in Nicaragua, Colombia in 2012, which is the map you see, and also in the South China Sea arbitration, which is not a maritime delimitation case, but it was important for us to portray it because the tribunal used clearly photos to determine that these islands were artificial islands without entitlements under the law of the sea. So in a nutshell, normally photos are and maps may influence the outcome of the dispute, depending on the source of these maps and photos and the context in which they are presented. And in this context of a presentation, the role of counsels and agents come into play, because sometimes, as Arif told before, they can be very creative in how they do so. So maps and photos can give you that flexibility to represent the best for your country you are defending before the court. And this is precisely what Arif is going to explain us more in detail, like how this flexibility and bending nature, so to call, of maps and photos can influence the outcome of a dispute, and therefore it comes a tricky element, which is why we are writing basically this paper, like to examine this flexibility. Up to you, Arif. Thanks.
Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, so we thought we'd give a couple of examples just to sort of unpack the theoretical bits of the paper that we've been talking about so far. So the examples that we chose were both from the Pedra Branca case that Carlos mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. So the first example is these maps. The one on the left was produced by Singapore. And so what's interesting about it is that it's so zoomed out that you can't really see Pedro Branca's relative proximity to Malaysian shore, just because it's just so tiny, right? And you see on the right, that is the map that Malaysia put forward in the ICJ, and you can see much more clearly where the disputed features are and how closer they are to the Malaysian mainland as opposed to the Singaporean mainland. So that's one way of showing how these maps, these visual representations, go beyond mere aids, beyond mere impartial neutral aids, and they become a part of that argumentative practice. And the second example involves photos, which I thought was really interesting because that's at least when you're looking at photos in the context of international adjudication, they tend to be very dry. You don't sort of like see this huge contrast between two different photos. So the one to the left, that's the one that Singapore put forward. This one on the right, Malaysia put forward. You can see here that's Pedro Branca, and to the back that's the Malaysian shoreline, and that mountain kind of disappears when you look at it from the Singaporean perspective. And so what the Singaporeans were saying was that the Malaysians had used a telephoto lens, and that had essentially exaggerated the height of that mountain by around 7 times. And their photo really recreates what you would see with a naked human eye. And notice there the sort of appeal to the language of impartiality and neutrality and the natural way of things. And so this again, I hope shows how these visual aids become an integral part of the legal argument. And what we're trying to do in the paper is we're trying to unpack as many examples as possible to show the choices at the heart of these visual aids. And so I thought I'd include this photo, which I came across in a coffee table book that I got for Christmas. It's a series of minimalist maps, and I thought it's really interesting to look at this because it really highlights the idea that these visual representations, they are made with quite a lot of choices. And so here you have different ways of looking at something that we're all very familiar with, the world map. But looking at these few selection of minimalist maps, you suddenly realize what we usually take for granted as the natural way of looking at the world avoids all these alternative ways of looking at things. And so that's really the idea. The idea for us is to go through the 51 cases that Carlos mentioned in the future iterations of the paper and to show the value-laden nature of these maps and photos when they're reproduced in international adjudication. And hopefully the aim is to explore these choices to show the problem with the reification of the visual in international adjudication and to repoliticize their use in international law. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. The next presentation, I think it lines up well with the first presentation that we had. This is by Nadia Cornioti. She's a associate lecturer at the University of Central Lancashire, at the Cyprus campus of the University of Central Lancashire, where she also did her PhD. Before that, she worked at the Cyprus Red Cross Society. And the reason I'm mentioning Cyprus repeatedly is because she's going to be talking about the place of islands in international law and how islands are treated and represented by international law. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Growing up and living in Cyprus makes this paper particularly dear to my heart. I hope you will not get this as being biased. So what I'm presenting today, the paper is based on a draft article I've been carrying with me for about a year now. Inspiration came from the theme of the Australian and New Zealand International Law Society conference last year, which was about international law and connectivity, and texts I had come across during my PhD. The one was by a group of international lawyers problematizing the paradox of islands as being both connected and disconnected from the rest of the world. And the other one was a history book, which was on the history of the Ottoman Islands in the Mediterranean, which again gave me a very unique perspective that me as a lawyer hadn't come across in terms of islandness. So having said that, I'm new to aesthetics, but when I read the call for papers, I really felt that aesthetics could fill in a gap I was feeling existed in the draft as it existed until then. So let me start. The most common definition of islands, and it's very similar to Article 121 of UNCLOS, is that islands are territories surrounded by water. So usually when we think about islands, we see our brain thinks about the seacoast, sometimes with umbrellas, and the blue water. Occasionally, depending on the island, across the water, you might see other mountains, the mainland, or you might see other islands or boats. But the idea is that usually we think of islands with our back turned to the territory of the island territory as such. We usually connect always to the islands to what lies beyond them, as opposed to what's happening on the island. And this is also reflected in the way we study about islands and we investigate the existence of islands. It's always, if you really think about it, it's almost always in relation to something else or somebody else that is beyond the insular coast. So I looked more into insularity and what that means. And there are two main ways of defining insularity. The one is the geographical condition of being an island or islandness, or what I call the natural condition of insularity. This is what is used by geographers and island study experts. However, if you really look at the definition of insularity in the dictionary, you will see another definition, what I call the social condition of insularity, which may refer to narrow-mindedness, isolation, and loneliness. So based on these two, I started reflecting a bit more on the existence of peoples or people who are located on islands and how islands are portrayed in international law. Looking first at critical geography and human geography, I was amazed to discover that geographers actually contest the concept of place, and they have also developed the equivalent, the other dimension of place, which is the dimension of space. So space is considered an abstract concept of what is surrounding us, and space is considered to be in constant change. And this space, according to geographers, is experienced differently by each culture. So whereas place is something we can paint on a map, space is the perception we have of the space surrounding us. Place, on the other hand, is a static concept developed exactly in order to be able for a human brain to make sense of the vastness of the space that is surrounding us. Islands, in that regard, are both spaces and places within the context of the global map and the continuous movement of the sea, which is an excellent representation of this, an allegory for space, if you like. The islands are a place that is static, where there is no movement and where you feel the break from the constant movement of the sea. At the same time, however, islands serve also as separate individual autonomous spaces where the people living there are actually feeling their own little universe of what they perceive around as the world around them. So according to critical geography, Doreen Macy, she said that if history is about time, geography is actually about space, and it's equally lively and challenging. And throughout her career, Macy was trying to convince her colleagues and the world that space should be taken as seriously as time. As somebody who has done most of her research on law and history, I was intrigued by the fact that indeed we rarely think of space in the same way as we think about time. So, leaving aside the geographical condition and the physics of space and time, I turn my focus on on the people living on the islands. And historians, a very good example is that we have centuries and centuries of written history of the Roman Empire. But the first step in trying to understand islands better from a historical perspective is a very recent development from around the 2000, when they started looking at the Mediterranean and the existence of Mediterranean islands within the context of bigger empires. So islands have been conceived by historians as closed systems that retain a very strong local identity within imperial borders. Very often the elites that were ruling the islands within the empires were actually had the luxury of being relatively autonomous from the center of the empires, and they enjoyed a sort of independence within the broader imperial borders. At the same time, the local population of islands is usually perceived as backward and poor and luckless peasants that have not much to contribute to the empire. So this I associate more with the social condition of insularity as this isolation and remoteness, or even narrow-mindedness that often islanders may be conceived to carry with them. However, the sea, not the islands, had really intrigued historians as early as Herodotus and Thucydides, who had written in their work about thalassocracies, those who are in control of the sea, because they had understood that whoever was in control of the sea would actually be able to impose their power to the region. And that's interesting how it connects with international law, because international law never really cared, or never, maybe unconsciously as international lawyers, we never really turned to see the experience of islanders as populations of islands. We actually have a whole area of international law called the law of the sea, which of course defines islands as territories surrounded by water. And it's becoming, as exactly the previous presentation showed, has been at the epicenter of global disputes on water, island control, and areas within water. So this natural condition is, of course, challenged. All of that, it's of course challenged, and international law and law of the sea specifically are already explaining the challenges they face with the developed technology, artificial islands, but also with climate change. But we still have not developed, in my view, the tools that can really unpack the many difficulties faced by the local populations. James Crawford, in an article of 1989, one of, I assume, in the earlier stages of his career, he had written extensively about the asymmetries between small island states compared to other mainland continental states, if you like. And he had identified that there is always a gap between the island states' formal equality and the substantive poverty and inequality in many of them. There are always difficulties in corresponding to the needs required in international organizations, in terms of administration, in terms of offering enough employees to take care. These are all issues that have been discussed here and there in international law. The security problems faced by islands are being magnified, and many islands, especially in the Pacific Ocean, have disproportionately large maritime zone, which actually, in the context of the law of the sea, puts the Pacific Islands in an advantageous position in terms of exploiting sources and so on. So islands are the invisible. However, if we look at an average world map, islands are the invisible dots on this map. Usually small states or smaller territories may belong also to continental states, so they are not necessarily even represented in international law. And being the invisible maps of the dots, the people living on those islands are the invisible humans to whom international law rarely gives a voice. So the invisible maps reference, according to Zoe Pearson in an article from 2008, is that it's more than just a cartographic analogy. International law is the very tool, she claims, that determines the discourse that defines borderlines on a map. The maps, geographers as well have criticized as being monodimensional, and that they fail to give us a full picture of understanding and perceiving the world to its broadest extent. So along with the invisibility of the natural condition of insularity, we also face the invisibility of the social condition of insularity. In my view, the Chagos advisory opinion is one of the excellent examples of how the people belonging to a specific territory were driven away from their own territory just for this island to be exploited by somebody else. Turning with more curiosity towards the dynamic notion of insularity, therefore, in my view, would prove a valuable opportunity towards expanding public international law static state-centric predisposition, which rarely reflects accurately the geopolitical positions and risks. So since this is an aesthetics of international law, I would like to rephrase it a bit to show that the invisible is actually forming, as we very well know, in our policies, and by having an aesthetic understanding of the world, we can actually address invisible dots on the map. So I have developed in this specific paper 3 case studies to show the insular experience. I'm not going to go into the detail, but we are all familiar with the campaigns that come from the Pacific Ocean on climate change. They have been pioneers in explaining and flagging the dangers of climate change in the last years. Another trend that we observe, Cyprus included, is islands being tax havens. And interestingly, historians have located the development of offshore financial services to the Caribbean, colonial Caribbean network of islands, which again has a tremendous impact on how we experience, how islands experience their financial situation at the moment. But with a focus especially on the social condition of insularity, I think insularity as a concept could help us understand isolated communities. So in the picture here, it's a satellite picture of Zaatari camp. So, and these camps, refugee camps, often develop a life of their own. There are very lively communities with schools, with very specific challenges, very specific issues, but we are finding difficult to bridge that into the vocabulary of classical or more positivist, if you like, international law. So the idea of perceiving these isolated communities as insular is actually coming from the very experience of 19th century studies of islands. During the 19th century, islands were seen as laboratories for evolutionary research, and even today they're recognized by island studies experts as places for socio-geographical studies of communal social relations. And this is because exactly due to the unique features developed within all islands, or isolated, if you like now, populations. In conclusion, what I try to do with this very brief presentation is to problematize insularity as a concept, both in its physical but also in its social dimensions. As I mentioned, James Crawford is just an example of an international law scholar who had actually addressed. Not forget that James Crawford himself was an islander, albeit an Australian. So James Crawford himself had correctly identified the asymmetries that exist in international relations when we talk about states that are islands, especially smaller island states. Island studies now it feels that is full with information, and they have been doing excellent work in understanding how islands function and what challenges exist. And even though it is exactly because it's an interdisciplinary field of studies, they're still struggling with the epistemological and methodological challenges. So I am not trying to find a solution or promote the idea that there is a need or how exactly we're going to address these asymmetries in international law, but rather that international law needs to join the dialogue that is ongoing in order to be able to find a way of addressing many of the challenges. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much. The next presenter is online. Martina is in the spirit of what Nadia just mentioned about interdisciplinary dialogue. Nadia is the non-lawyer on the panel. She's an artist, a designer, a researcher who currently works with Human Rights Watch as a spatial and visual researcher. Previously, she's taught and worked with architectural design, and with her work, she's won numerous awards, and her work has been exhibited in numerous places. Her paper concerns questions about how what she calls digital spatial jurisprudence is engaged with in international law. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Great. So I'll just share my screen. Thank you so much for having me here and accommodating for the online presentation. I really appreciate it. And I'm really regretful that I couldn't be there in person. So the prompt for my contribution to this conference was the perception of a disconnect between the evidentiary capacity of spatial research and the simultaneous limited admissibility of these artifacts into legal processes, including international legal processes. With the first open source investigations about 15 years ago for the purposes of human rights research, while these developed, the spatial analysis and visual representations developed alongside. The earliest examples produced by agencies like Forensic Architecture set the tone for the forensic spatial aesthetic. Multiple news organizations like New York Times adopted the spatial storytelling style, and increasingly different journalistic agencies are also building their own visual investigative labs. At the same time, NGOs are building spatial research into their workflows. So for example, Human Rights Watch started this process by hiring their first spatial researcher, me, a year ago, in order to integrate this sort of research into standard ways of working. Here on screen, you can see several examples of the work I produced for Human Rights Watch. So most scholarship and descriptions of these kind of digital artifacts, which I call artifacts of spatial jurisprudence, they tend to focus on the technovisual promise of tools and methodologies. But it was my assumption that if we look critically at the potential limitations of these artifacts, we may be able to identify what stands in the way of integration of spatial and visual evidence into legal processes. I also wanted to see if we can start developing a better visual literacy and standards and codifications for assessment and for legibility of visuals as evidence. I will start in a perhaps unexpected place with this drawing. I think that beyond the superficial, the key to understand principles of spatial jurisprudence is understanding the logic with which the imagery is constructed, and how this logic relates to the source data and the conventions of representation from which they're borrowing. And the primary convention is the architectural drawing. In here, the drawing that I really like to use to explain the principles of architectural representations and resulting aesthetic qualities is this cross-section from early 19th century produced by Karl Schinkel for a house which is now Szczecin in Poland. And that's where the house is. So this drawing is really highly detailed, and it includes all the connections and elements for the intended building in the intended size. But one element in the drawing stands out. So it's that gap between one of the lower and upper rafters. So ultimately on site, this gap will be filled. But the drawing leaves the gap to inform the builder that this rafter is not the one carrying the main load of the roof, and its measurement will have to be calculated on site. And this is a very meaningful signal from the architect. They're aware that contrary to the medium of drawing, the final building will most likely be prone to material and physical imperfections. It's also likely that the weight of the elements on site will warp and shift the final form, resulting in different internal dimensions than the ones that the architect may assume on the basis of the drawing alone. The same logic pertains to visualizations of spatial evidence. There is a limit to representation guided by what information is provided by source visuals. So usually we have only a few recordings, few photographs from which we try to reconstruct a building or a site where an event happened. So very often we need to infer what isn't visible from the information that we have. And it's really important to express this limitation in the final product. There are several ways and several sort of visual aesthetics that this can be done in. In most cases, the convention of exposing the limits of available source is photo matching of the original footage and showing it against the 3D model. So this is one of the examples in which this is conventionally done. In other examples, we can use projections of the same source photographs on top of the 3D model, signifying to the audience that the researchers' detailed knowledge of the site is restricted and limited to the source material. In some examples, we see sort of these icons of the source photographs or cameras being placed in the model of the site, which is not explaining exactly the process, but it's a gesture from the researchers signifying that they have some sort of control over the site. And again, they're limited to the source material. This is an example from work by Susan Schutley from the series Cold Cases, where we see these sort of icons of the source material. And here we have a mapping of the limits of source footage on the side represented as shadows. There are also cases where a study of the limits of source footage can be is crucial to the investigation, and it can be explained in other visual formats, like in this case where an isovis mapping is showing what is hidden on site from the point of view of that footage. So here in the colored fields, we see what is restricted from view. And what is essentially missing from the footage. And on this basis, for example, we prepared a spatial temporal recording of movements of officers on the site of the killing of Mark Dagan in London in 2011. And this was used as part of the research of forensic architecture to understand the probability of one of the key hypotheses for the investigation. A more conventional aspect of this representation of limitation and hierarchy of knowledge within the 3D model is the use of detail and color in the model. So in this case of border clashes in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which we released recently with Human Rights Watch, we see that there's higher level of detail and realistic textures for some parts of the site that were particularly important to the case and for which we had more detailed recordings. Then there's a medium level of detail where the sort of resolution of the model itself drops off, but we still retain some color. And then there is another lower level of detail where we have simplified forms and simpler use of color with mostly monochrome textures. So if we return to the study of Schinkel's image, we will see that it also exists in aesthetic duality between convention, or what I would call codified representation, and realism. So you can see that there are these pink fields in the image, and they signify the elements of the building that are cut through the imaginary image plane to construct the cut-through drawing. So that's part of the codified language of the image. But then we see that there are shadows inside of the building, and that they are an attempt at realism. They're sort of talking about the intended light conditions of the building as it's imagined on the site of the where the building is going to be built. So this uncanniness of the drawing is, in this case, excused by the architectural drawing convention and its purpose. And the purpose is to communicate with both the client and the builder. But this uncanniness is definitely a feature of this spatial, of the artifacts of spatial jurisprudence. And I want to show that on the example of another quite recent case that Human Rights Watch worked on, which is an analysis of a suspected Russian airstrike on a civilian building in Izum. So over 40 people died in this airstrike, and the investigation itself focused on the story of one of the few survivors, Mikhailo Tsenchuk, who lost his entire family. One of the final sequences of animations that we produced to explain this shows a cross-section through the building. And this cross-section is indicating the state of the building before and after the airstrike. It's showing where Mikhailo's family was at the time of the airstrike in relation to their apartment 2 floors above, and in relation to where Mikhailo himself was at the time of the airstrike. So this artifact of spatial jurisprudence in an uncanny way does not translate the scale of loss and suffering experienced in this horrific event. The cross-section reveals empty rooms devoid of detail. There's no furniture, nor people. The impersonal voids on one hand belong to the diagrammatic convention, but on another level, when we are confronted with the comparison of the building before and after the airstrike, the lack of human scale and detail contrasted with the awareness of the event that happened contributes to the feeling of uncanniness. And arguably, it may be useful and more emphatic to add the human component. Arguably, if I inferred the internal layout and arrangement of the spaces, it would not only impact the object of the investigation, it wouldn't impact the object of the investigation and the scope of storytelling. But this representation would shift the balance between reconstruction and illustration in the favor of illustration. And when we as researchers can't rely on source material and need to use visual representations, this opens up the possibilities for bias. So for example, in this case, if I was to reconstruct the interior of the apartment and I would have to choose the furniture, that furniture could be representing the family structures and economic status. And the work would no longer be speaking about the memory of individual survivors. It would be using generalization, obscuring their legacy and their past, and will be, shifting this whole investigation in favor of outside perspective. And this is not something that we intend to do with our reconstructions. And instead, I would like to argue that these voids and empty rooms do not override memory, but rather leave a gap to be inscribed by our imagination, as well as memory of relatives and survivors. Last aspect of the drawing of Karl Schinkel that really relates to the aesthetics of spatial jurisprudence is the different levels of detail that are used in the drawing package. So this is a very conventional architectural approach. Different drawings operate in different scales, and in here, a one-to-one drawing is talking about high detail of the cornice, while the lower scale detail is talking about the general principle of the building. And what distinguishes this conventional practice from the practices of modern day architecture and design is that right now we have 3D tools that let us work directly in one-to-one scale. So instead of working primarily on different scaled drawings, we already from the very beginning operate in a one-to-one scale. And we have much greater access to realistic renderings and drawings than it would have been before. The extreme example of this design through 3D simulation is the use of game engines that are increasingly adopted by the architecture industry, allowing for digital construction of even entire cities in a matter of hours. They're complete with photorealistic textures and simulations, adding also lighting and weather conditions. This is something that we also use in our investigations, and it's an extremely promising tool. However, it has many limitations, and I would like to explain it through one final example of the investigation at the Polish-Belarusian border. So from the summer of 2021 until now, the border between Poland and Belarus has become the site of a humanitarian crisis. Multiple migrating people from Middle East and Africa have been trapped at the border between the two countries and subjected to multiple pushbacks by Polish border guards and organized mass pushes by the Belarusian forces. Many of them have been subject to further violence, abuse, and suffering. And the problem is that the law enforcement periodically confiscated and damaged the phones of the migrating people, which erased visual and location data records. So what do we do in the absence of visual documentation? As a small collective that I co-established, we decided to adopt the situated testimony technique that was popularized as a research method by forensic architecture a couple of years ago. This process involves an interview with the witness with the use of visuals. In the case of Polish-Belarusian border, we created a catalog of local plants, vehicles of both types of law enforcement, and other characteristic items. And then in the process of the visual interview with two witnesses who were together for most of their journey, we conducted an interview where we employed this visual library, and we would place the visual library in the game engine in real time, recreating the testimonies of the witnesses. So this is a little bit of a preview of the final reconstruction of one of the locations. Let's see if it starts. If it doesn't, we can absolutely move on. Yes, I think there is a limitation to my internet. Okay, let's move on then. What I wanted to show is that through a first-person reconstruction, we were actually able to reconstruct the locations in two different recollections of two different survivors. And we actually saw that although their recollections differed a little bit, there were enough commonalities between the two recollections that we were able to actually geolocate the place that they described, which was a military base on the Belarusian side of the border. What was, however, really unexpected is that in the process of modeling of the site of this base in particular, we asked about the material on the surface of the road. And so our question of materiality was just to complete the 3D model. And our obvious suspicion was that the road would be either asphalt or a forest dirt road. But when the witnesses gave us the answer that the road was made out of sand, we asked follow-up questions. And together with the witnesses, we modeled a tool that they described seeing next to the road. This tool resembled a rake, but it had some unique features. They described that it was lacking teeth at the end. And the witnesses then explained that the reason for this was that the tool was actually used by the guards in the military base to sweep the sand flat so that they could spot any traces of the migrants that the migrants would leave. Any traces that the migrants left their assigned spot, essentially. So this seemingly mundane detail is evidence that the people were kept in the camp under force and under surveillance, and not voluntarily as it was claimed by some politicians and media. This investigation into the abuse of the Polish-Belarusian border opened up a series of questions about generating images in the absence of other visual evidence, such as video or photographs. Currently, with the developments in visual generation by artificial intelligence, we see that there is an incredible capacity and a booming potential of imaging the unknown with just simple verbal input. The concern with these sort of images is that the imagination is restricted to the source data set and linguistic interpretation of algorithms. Arguably, we are already using algorithms in projects like the Polish-Belarusian situated testimony. So is this sort of new artificial intelligence, quote unquote, panic, also a trigger to revisit the reliability of the current method. The other issue pertains to the perception of these visualizations by the public. Similarly to the
Martina,
AI,
if you could please wrap up.
Yes, I'm wrapping up.
Thank you.
Similarly to the imagery generated by artificial intelligence, even with disclaimers and explanations of the principles of the image generation process, the fact that the images are an interpretation may be lost to the public. So I'm going to wrap up then, and I hope that these examples provide a good overview of current aesthetic and digital spatial and potential of digital spatial jurisprudence. That's it from me then.
Thank you. I think that walked us through the conventions and the process very well. The final presentation is by Professor Kamil Zeidler and Magdalena Laguska. Both of them are at the University of Gdansk. Professor Zeidler is the chair of the Department of Theory and Philosophy of State Law, and Magdalena is a director of the Confucius Center, a Confucius Institute at the university. And their presentation concerns the way aesthetic considerations feature in and shape international cultural heritage law.
Okay, we can keep it here. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me thank you, the scientific committee of the conference. We are very, very glad to be here with you. And we would like to present a very specific subject, trying to answer how aesthetics could deal with international cultural heritage law. But anyway, maybe it is better if you will sit for a moment. It will be much more convenient for you, please. My colleague is the one who did the work, so she has to rest a little bit. But how should I start? Maybe with the sentence, I don't know if you can accept it, but let me say, lawyers are boring. The law is boring, and lawyers are boring as well. And trying to find a proof that this is not true, I started to deal with aesthetics of law, or maybe more familiar. When my daughter was 6, she told me, "Daddy, your books are so boring. There are no pictures inside." And I realized that there is a way to put pictures, photographs, art, fine art, sculpture, paintings, drawings, and others into the legal books. It was the way to search the connections between the beauty and the law. Of course, first of all, we have to answer what the aesthetics is, and then what the aesthetics of law is. Following one of the most famous Ludwig Wittgenstein ideas, the famous Austrian-British philosopher born here in Vienna, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. That's why we try to answer, that's why we look for the definitions. However, it was a problem, which approach would be better. There are two typical approaches in legal sciences. One is very typical for the common law, representatives of the common law systems, and they start from the case and then try to find a solution, and then they try to find an answer, and maybe at the end of the way of searching, they try to build some general conclusions. The other is very typical for the representatives of civil law countries. This continental way of thinking was famous of its great narrations in law and politics and political sciences. Giving only two examples of great Austrian philosophers of law like Hans Kelsen or Georg Jelinek. They tried to build something great, and after that, they came from the great theory to the cases, examining one after another. That's why it is so difficult to meet in the middle of the way, find the same way of thinking. It was something what told me famous Professor Desmond Manderson, that we, lawyers from common law systems, starts from different way and you from different. Anyway, in critical legal studies, there are so many proofs that great narrations are no vivid anymore, that there cannot be applied to our world, to our societies, to our countries, to our politics and economics. However, what we started 10 years ago at the University of Gdańsk with a group of my colleagues, including Dr. Magdalena Łągiewska, was the project to define the aesthetics of law. And we tried to understand it as a fifth branch of philosophy of law. You all have to accept the concept that these typical four branches are epistemology of law, ontology of law, legal logic, ethics, and we tried to add one more. It is the aesthetics of law, and it is very, very close to how the philosophy in general is divided into such five fields. I think that our result is, of course, but I will say it, is quite interesting. And we cut aesthetics of law into three frames or three dimensions. The first one is to searching for the law in fine arts. So going to museum, going to library, going to archives, we try to find everything what is strictly connected with the law. Then, so it is called the aesthetics of law in external frame. Aesthetics of law in internal frame is searching for the beauty in the law. So if we treat the legal act or legal writings as a works of art, then we can maybe find this important value, I mean the beauty in the law. And the third dimension is the influencing or answering the question how law influence the beauty or the world of arts or the world of literature, film, and so on. Within the third dimension, I mean how law influence the beauty, if it, and I'm sure that it is, I would like to ask my younger talented colleague to present the second part of our presentation.
So thank you very much. First of all, I also would like to thank organizer for such a wonderful event, and especially Tommaso, who just left, for bringing all the scholars from all over the world in Vienna, and it's a wonderful event. So I'm very happy to be here with you. Very briefly, this is just something that it's a kind of a division and different approaches to aesthetics of law in general. So briefly, you could classify it into three different ways. So first of all, law and aesthetics. So somehow intervention of law in aesthetics. The second one, law as aesthetics. So we had some examples and other presentation on aesthetics judgments, for instance, during this 2 days. And the third one, law in aesthetics, which is just understood as law which is subject to aesthetics. And coming back to the topic, because this is the idea I would like to focus on. So aesthetics in international law, and actually two different approaches. So the first one, international cultural heritage law, but also in somehow international humanitarian law, also known as law of the armed conflicts. The first one, so international cultural heritage law. Very briefly, we have UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage, adopted in 1972. And according to the preamble of this convention, it's the duty of the international community as a whole to participate in the protection of the cultural and natural heritage of outstanding universal value. And if we go further and would like to analyze it, what is quite surprising that even from the definition of natural heritage, we have explicit reference to aesthetics. So natural features consisting of physical and biological formations or groups of such formations which are of outstanding universal value from the aesthetic or scientific point of view. And again, outstanding universal value, if there is no definition, there is a common consensus saying that it should be described as having cultural and or natural significance that is so exceptional that it goes beyond national boundaries. And it should be, and it's important for current and future generations of humanity. And one more reference to some normative acts. So operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. And most specifically, we have criterion 7, which also refers to natural heritage sites that have to contain superlative natural phenomena or areas of exceptional natural beauty and aesthetic importance. It's just to show you that it's not only about our perception of aesthetics, which is quite obvious when we think about cultural heritage, but also to prove that we have the wording aesthetic even within normative acts such as international conventions, and this is one of the examples concerning UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage. And here, something that is quite common and probably you have seen it a lot of times. So this is the World Heritage Emblem, which is a unique emblem introduced in 1978 with the aim to identify sites that have been listed on the World Heritage List. And of course, here, it also has some aesthetic value. So if you look at this emblem, it represents the connection between cultural and natural properties, but it has been also designed by a Belgian artist actually in such a way that it's a connection between human being and also the nature. So it's just a question how to balance properly a human with a nature. And final point on international humanitarian law, I just divided it in this way, but actually you could also say that it's something very close to international cultural heritage law because it covers cultural properties, but actually in the times of the armed conflicts. So here we have another convention, the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Properties in the event of armed conflict, which prohibits the destruction and seizure of cultural property, which means that actually cultural properties are exempt from any attacks because they cannot be used for military purposes. And that's why it requires also to take appropriate measures to safeguard cultural properties. And we have a special distinctive emblem, which is widely recognized as Blue Shield. So it looks like this. And we have 3 different possibilities how to protect cultural heritage during the armed conflicts. So the first one, you see blue and navy emblem, which can be used completely alone. It's just a general protection under international law. So it means that it could be covered everywhere when we have some cultural properties. So just to show that these objects are exempted from any attacks by military forces during the conflict. The second thing is just blue shield emblem, which is repeated 3 times in a triangular formation. And this is the case when we have a special protection. So we have cultural properties that are very important, but less important than enhanced protection covered by the third one, which means that here we have a second protocol to the Hague Convention, so from 1999, and here a special list of cultural properties of great significance for the humanity. So it means that we have another way of thinking. So we come back to these pictures or images or symbols that are very common in international law to show that it's not only about some aesthetics, so how to your perception of cultural heritage, because it's quite obvious if you go to see, I don't know, you go to a museum and you see some paintings, but here we have also some symbols, and it's just a perfect match to the first presentation of the keynote speech we had yesterday, actually, when we had SDGs and different symbols which have been representing different kinds of goals adopted by the UN Agenda 2030. So here, once again, we have pictorial law within international law to show. Of course, this is not, the whole list. It's just a few examples to show you how it looks like, but we can find much more examples which are very close and linked to international cultural heritage law. So thank you very much. I know that we are heading to the coffee break, so I try to be very concise. Thank you.
We are running short on time, but we can still take questions. So whoever has questions, please. Yes, of course. You can.
Hello. So my question is Magdalena, because I come from a country where there are multiple. It's part of a lot of cultural protection debates, but I'm not familiar with the blue shield, to be honest. So I was wondering, when you give us the 3 different shields, can you give us specific examples of signs that may be protected under them? Because I am trying to understand the differentiation between the enhanced, like what would take for a cultural heritage site to be protected under the third, and what would it take to be protected under the first shield, and also who determines under what shield? Is it the member state or is the ICRC? Or I'm really clueless. Thank you.
So can I answer, or we wait for all the questions?
Right. Yeah. All right. I'm sorry for my ignorance. Is it prohibited to attack cultural buildings? I mean, marked ones, or I remember there is something under the ICC statutes that it's considered. Okay, yeah, welcome. Okay, so the answer is inside, but only if it is marked, no? Or no. And there are some marks also of medical units, the Red Cross and the Crescent. Okay, thank you. Just a comment.
Hi, I have a question to Dr. Carniotti. Sorry for pronouncing your name. So I'm a lawyer, but I'm also an archaeologist, and I was wondering about your perspective, because you said that the islanders do not feel included into the international law. But I'm just wondering, is there any research whether the islanders actually want to be included, and whether they do not feel that the loneliness is actually better for them? I'm asking from the perspective because you did say that about the perspective of the space and time, but I'm thinking like whether it is not just our Western thinking, like we are thinking about, for example, the time in a linear way. So we are thinking about the horizontal way from the east to the west. But many cultures do not see the time together with the space the same way as we see it. So they do not see the boundaries and the territory of the island as we see it, as something closed and secluded from the rest. So I'm just wondering whether the islanders do not prefer to actually stay excluded from the rest of it, obviously with keeping the rights and the basic laws that are obvious for them, like the human rights. But I'm thinking like whether it would not lead to the globalization that is not necessarily the right thing for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. So one question for Professor Adigun, and then one question for Aref and Carlos. So Professor Adigun, to what extent can you see an expression of cubism in international economic law? And I'm saying this because aside from the Western narrative, linking to what I presented yesterday, we've seen that the other narrative so far, the alternative one, which is mostly from China with the Belt and Road Initiative, and its precise expression in Africa, we cannot really say it is anything different from a power-based expression that we have the means, we have the capacity, and we enter. So to what extent you can see any different narrative or more cubism away from power in international economic law? And the second question to Aref and Carlos is, what have you seen so far from the analysis of whether a representation of a map or representation is more objective when it's closer to what the eyes or the senses get, or what is closer to what is the objective reality according to science? Because many times, and you saw the previous picture with the Petra Blanca, that the eyes can see a particular type or can see to a specific extent, while to the contrary, maybe science or the way we capture it objectively may be different. So what we have seen so far, what is more persuasive and what should be more persuasive when examining in the specific instance of territorial disputes? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would really interesting things also on maps and territories, and I really like the pictogram going back to the first session. Just two questions. One on the islands. I'm not sure if you saw that's basically going against what you said on the islands. There's this map on the Palestine's West Bank archipelago. So someone made a map considering Palestinian territories as islands because they thought actually islands and archipelagos are particularly protected under international law. And it's like, okay, if basically the Palestinian lands would be an island, we would receive more protection by basically international law and international diplomacy about that. So I would be interested in your view of that. I found that incredibly interesting to look at it in a different way. I found it also particularly difficult because, of course, it's not a wide space and it's not a sea, but it's places where people live and also have homes. But I found a different idea of looking at territory, and that goes to the map question, quite fascinating. And to our first speaker, I was wondering, I think what you just did was kind of what we are discussing when international lawyers use metaphors more than the cubism as such. So I just thought, okay, you looked at cubism as a metaphor for inequality in different areas of international law. And of course, there have been a lot of research also on the pictures and the particularly painting disciplines that, for example, international lawyers use on their books. No, I think Sean Daspermo wrote that paper on what is basically on the fronts of international law books. And cubism, I think, is not so particularly relevant, but it's definitely better than impressionism or something like that. So do you think there's anything specific of cubism, or is it for you one among many metaphors of using and rethinking international law about that? Because I think maybe Pablo Picasso and all those people are not really maybe the authors that you would like to inspire through. If you want to have more inequality and less sexism and more visibility for underprivileged voices. Thank you.
More questions.
I have a question to Aref and Carlos. It's about in the cases that you've been checking, you mentioned, I think, 50-something cases. Did you see any use of old maps and history to justify territorial disputes? You mentioned Peru and Chile disputing the coast, and those maps were drawn 200, no, I think 500 years ago. So it's quite old dispute in that sense. So I was just curious, and if there is any debate on the influence of coloniality and European states, because they were the ones who draw. So not only in Latin America, entire Americas, but also Africa and Asia, they influenced a lot the borders. So yeah, thank you.
Tommaso.
Thank you. Fantastic panel. We have so many questions for all the speakers. Let me ask one to Magdalena. I had the benefit of reading the article that you have written, and unlike some other attendees at the conference, and I think it's really a great work. You refer to that connection to Annelise Israel's opener today. I just wanted to share a little story. It's more a comment than a question, but I remember being struck by the case of Machu Picchu in Peru, where qualifying Machu Picchu as one of the 7 wonders of the world, so not necessarily, so it was already a UNESCO World Heritage, but also tacking on one of the 7 wonders of the world label had such a big impact on ongoing litigation between the Peruvian government and the occupants of Machu Picchu over ownership, adverse possession or not. So I do see a lot of political effects in this tagging exercise, and I'm very curious to see where this further research takes you, because I think it's very exciting.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I think I have 2 questions. Yes, one has to do with international economic law, and then the emergence of China as a strong force. Your question is that, do I foresee international economic law being devoid of power politics? For now, I don't. Yes. But I don't want to sound too pessimistic. There's no doubt that China is coming as a powerful force. So the United States that dominates now probably may have to recede, but it won't recede easily. So maybe we can find a common ground. So maybe the old force and the new force can see the reason now that power politics alone should not dominate. So if they see a reason, because in my metaphor, I didn't rule out political actors, international actors. In fact, they dominate it. We can't rule out international law because international law is produced by international actors. So for now, I've not seen it not being dominated by power politics, but I'm an incurable optimist. I think I'm hopeful that the emerging force of China may make United States to become more reasonable, and then maybe we can have a better common ground. So, the second question, I think it has to do a bit with contestation. Do I think Cubism as a metaphor is appropriate? Yes, I think it does. But one thing you need to understand about metaphor is that metaphors generally are not value neutral. Yes, they are laden with values. For example, if you see international law as a web of net cast in a river to catch fish, your understanding is that you should take as much from it as you can and leave the rest for whoever cares. So if that's your vision of international law, then it simply means take as much as you can, be more selfish as you can be. Or if you see it as a jungle dominated by wild animals and the not so powerful ones like lions, elephants, tigers, and of course you also have squirrel. So that visualization metaphor simply means this is a jungle. Take as much as you can, destroy whoever you can destroy, and move on. Yes. But I don't think that can add a lot of values to how we can reform international law. So Cubism itself comes here now as a reform metaphor. Yes. The artist then did not emphasize it, but I'm relying on my own visual, yes, what I see it. They didn't see it as art in protest. No. Although it was an artistic effort to challenge, because realism was the dominating approach then. And of course, after Picasso and Braque were influenced by African art, they now decided to go against the existing tradition. So in the same way, Cubism, the more reason I didn't say realism, Cubism, and international, I deliberately emphasized Cubism because I see it as a metaphor of reform. So instead of foregrounding some interest and then backgrounding some interest, why not put all interest at the same time on this canvas of international? So it is in reformative sense that I think Cubism is very relevant. Thank you very much.
A really interesting question on what should be persuasive in terms of the visual representations of the factual issues in a case. Marius was saying something about, would it be closer to what you see with naked eye? Would that be the objective truth? But what's interesting is what you see with your naked eye is precisely subjective. So that should be what is not objective, right? But the problem is, in the Pedra Branca case, that was precisely the issue that Malaysia faced. They were seen as the party that manipulated things by representing a visual that you couldn't see with your naked eye. So there is this interesting paradox. What should be persuasive? I don't know. The whole point that we're making is that it's very malleable. It's very indeterminate. And that's not a surprise if you really think about it. I mean, as a trade lawyer, we're very familiar with battles of experts. And if you have those expertise, like quote unquote scientific expertise that can go back and forth, it's not that surprising that visual representations are also very indeterminate and malleable. But yeah, I thought it was a really interesting question that you asked. Yeah, on the use of old maps. Actually, I think I'm gonna leave this to Carlos because he's a lot more knowledgeable about this. But one of the things that I did come across, which is interesting, was a painting. So the Pedra Branca case, obviously, it also has a colonial background to it. The dispute has a colonial background to it. And there was a painting from, if I'm not mistaken, early 19th century. And it was a painting of one of the lighthouses on the Pedra Branca. And I thought that's really cool. Actually, I'd never seen a painting in international proceedings before, but I'm sure Carlos has some interesting maps that he's come across in the Latin American context specifically.
Yeah, concerning the use of historical maps, yeah, most of the territorial disputes indeed entail this discussion of historical maps, historical documents, in a sort to say that even lawyers at some point become historians to try to come up with the best reliable information to prove their claim. And just to give you an example of how historical maps may prove to be tricky, for many years there was this island in the Gulf of Mexico, Bermeja Island, which was, well, first Spanish and later on was apparently transmitted to Mexico. And then since I think 16th century, official maps, including this island, were published by the Crown and later on by Mexican government until the 1940s. And suddenly they stopped publishing maps including such an island. The issue came at hand when Mexico and the United States started the limitation process of the continental shelf in the Gulf of Mexico, where, as you know, oil and gas is one of the gold mines. And well, Mexico started looking at the historical maps and okay, hey, there is this little island, Bermeja. Where is it? Because suddenly we don't see them after 1940s. And they sent actually an expedition to look at it, like the Navy and the university, the National University of Mexico. They didn't find it. And then there started emerging like this series of whether the CIA exploited the island or disappeared in order for the United States to gain more maritime areas. But apparently it was more a cartographer mistake that was later on replicated. So this is just to say, like, yes, territorial disputes entail a lot of historical documents that may be tricky and grant this level of flexibility and malleability depending on the context. So that was a problematic that we were trying to bring up, like in the case of historical documents, you can bring up direct evidence, but then how you use it for, in favor of your claim, that's the interesting part, the tricky part, maybe.
Okay, so my turn. I have two questions. I will take them in reverse. Thank you, Sylvia, for mentioning that, because actually the first time I was discussing this paper, occupied territories came on the table with the West Bank, but now I don't remember whether somebody mentioned exactly what you're mentioning. So I've made a note on that. And indeed, this is where the idea of insular societies came in. There are societies, there are territories that are under the radar in international law, and obviously the West Bank is an excellent example. And I can see why the archipelago is used in that context. But I refer to a refugee camp instead, especially the specific one, because being in the middle of the desert takes the place of the sea. And let's not forget that deserts used to be seas many, many thousands, I don't know, years ago. But that absolutely connects to that last case study. So you're absolutely right. And then on the first question, thank you for it, because it gives me the opportunity to clarify a few things that couldn't make it to the presentation. So first of all, there are two misunderstandings or two tendencies. When we talk about islands, we tend to think about small islands. When we talk about climate change, we tend to think about the Pacific, which are extremely small islands. But not all islands are small, and not all islands are developing states. On the contrary, we have Japan and the UK being major military powers throughout most of their history. So I think this is where island studies experts have the difficulty epistemologically, methodologically, to study islands, because islands are so diverse. So my aim was just to show that when you deal with islands, there is a reason to acknowledge that island communities have specific characteristics that differentiate them. And you asked whether there is any research on islanders that wanted to be included. I have given only one example of islanders that have been struggling a lot with international law, the Chagosians, which also connects to Sylvia's question, because I was wondering if the Chagosians were mainlanders and not islanders, they would probably be called occupied people, right? Or displaced people or something of that sort. And I also wanted to point out this insularity in narrow-mindedness. I mean, I studied in the UK, and I always felt how beyond Great Britain, there's always overseas, whether we talk about Europe or the US. And then I saw that materializing with Brexit. Actually, a lot of the Brexit narrative, at least my experience as somebody who lived for quite a few years in the UK, I felt that it was coming because of this, to a certain extent, to this idea that islands are the center of the world. And, Cypriots also believe that about their island. So I have that experience there too. In Australia, however, which was a big settler colony, there was a really nice paper explaining how the Aboriginal communities had a completely different vision of Australia rather than the settler communities, in the sense that when Australia became a colony, the emphasis was on the coast, because that was connecting the communities with the rest of the world, with their homelands, with the metropolis, if you like. Whereas in indigenous imagination, the center, the outback of Australia is of paramount importance, because that's where their livelihoods was dependent on the bush, and knowing their way around the massive desert in the center of Australia. So even within islands, we can see different people having different views about their island, and it is a complex topic. So I'm not planning to give all the answers. I just want to point out that them being separated by the sea has a sort of, or by desert, as we were saying right now, does give a different perspective, and this perspective is very often missing, and it's causing asymmetries at international law level. So thank you very much for your questions and comment. And very briefly, because I know that we run out of time for this panel. Your question, actually, as I mentioned during my presentation, there are some requirements that should be met according to Hague Convention and after the second protocol. And then you could have this enhanced or special protection. But what is the problem here? It's not with all these marks that you could put on some cultural properties, but rather about the effectiveness of making that, because we all know that during the armed conflicts, we have too many damages and destruction of cultural heritage. And I think this is the key point here. And Moshe, just to make sure how it really works. So one, I think, of the best examples of the crimes against cultural heritage concerns Timbuktu in Mali, and a judgment which was issued against Al-Mahdi, who just attacked mausoleums and very religious places in Mali. And it was the precedent case heard by the ICC. We just covered, cultural heritage, but we don't have within Rome Statute specific crimes against cultural heritage. So it was rather written as crimes against humanity, because here we talk about cultural heritage, which is of such a great importance to the humanity. That's why they try to find solution, and it was just a precedent case. So he went to jail, and he had to pay a compensation of several millions of euros. And finally, coming to Tommaso, I agree with you. I mean, I also think that it's quite connected, and it's also a question of some politics behind. So I think that we cannot divide it simply, but sometimes we also play with this. And very often when it comes to restitution, for instance, of cultural properties, we know that there is some politics behind. So more broadly, this is also the question. And maybe you would like to add something.
What we should emphasize, Magda focused on this science in international treaties, and science are very important in communication. Language is a system of science, but sometimes when we cannot understand each other, when we use very different languages, then we can show something like this or many others, and it could be understood all around the world. And that's why people try to design, to implement such a science. And in my book titled Aesthetics of Law, I have a chapter called Pictorial Law, because authorities responsible for establishing the law, they also introduce science in the legal system. Let me show you an example just outside the window. Road signs. It's something which could be understood not only in Austria, but in other countries, probably all over the world. We can read it, we can understand it. So let me just, in last words, tell you something quite interesting. Polish delegates to the UNESCO conference, where they started to write the Hague Convention 1954, were quite maybe from the other side. There was one very famous Polish historian of art, Jan Zachwatowicz, and Professor Jan Zachwatowicz was sitting as a delegate of the Polish delegation during the discussion about the Hague Convention. It was just after the Second World War stopped. Europe was in ruins. Both Vienna, Warsaw, Dresden, all those cities bombed. And they were sitting and discussing about the sign. And someone said, okay, we have to find a proper sign. And the Roerich Pact, it was the Japanese style, three elements. And Jan Zachwatowicz was sitting and writing on the paper his first letters of his name and surname. Jan, in Polish you write it with E, with a G. Jan is G, Zachwatowicz Z. and they asked, "What's to do with a sign?" And someone looked at the piece of paper and they said, "Oh, it's great. We can walk on it." And it's how they create the famous sign for the protection of cultural property. So let's make the Polish point at the end of this session. Thank you very much.
So yeah, we're well over time. So if there are any, we can carry forward the conversation in the coffee break. And please once again join me in thanking the panelists.
Fantastic. Well, our aesthetic marathon is almost coming to an end, but to conclude our exploration of the 2 very exciting days, we have one final panel of tremendous speakers with papers and presentations that I thought I could kind of combine under a common theme. So when I chose the panel title, I chose Digital Media and International Law Remapping the System. Now, in hindsight, maybe the title is a little reductionist, because we will hear about, in a very broad sense, how technological developments, technological media are reshuffling, displacing our aesthetic perceptions of law and international law in particular. And to begin this exploration, we have Mia Sport. Mia, can you see and hear as well?
Hi, hello. Yes.
There you are. Fantastic. Mia, will you be sharing your screen, or would you like for us to do it from here?
I'll do it from my side.
Okay, great. Okay. So Mia is a senior lecturer in international human rights law at Edge Hill University, with a particular focus and expertise in international criminal law, transitional justice, and human rights law. She obtained her PhD at Leiden in 2006, and she's also admitted as an attorney in the High Court of South Africa. Today, Mia will talk to us about a theme that has hardly surfaced through our discussions, but that is, of course, very present in today's debates. That is, well, the notion of war, and in particular, the war in Ukraine. And Mia, whenever you want, the floor is yours. We look forward to listening to you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso, and hello to everybody. I just wanted to ask you whether it's clear this, I don't know how to enlarge it quite.
I think that if you press on, yeah.
Mia, if I may, below. It's below. You know, you have, like, besides notes, you have some buttons. Try one of them. The one with 4 squares, I mean, or the book.
Yeah,
the book. Yeah, that one. I think it's slideshow or something. Try that one. Try and press it, and on your computer should appear like it's presentation mode.
In the down right corner of your screen.
In the down right corner, yeah.
There should be like a
on her screen, on her PDF, on her PowerPoint. No,
oh,
then
okay.
On the book, then on the book.
Well,
on the book. If you press on the little book sign right next to the button you just pressed, it should turn that into full view mode.
Okay. I'm sorry.
It's just next to the button, on the right of the button you just pressed. There's a little book icon. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, here we go. It's perfect now.
Okay, all right. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks very much for that assistance. I'm speaking about electronic media, but I'm evidently not an expert myself. So I would like to run you through a slideshow, a quick slideshow before I start getting into the meat of my talk. So this is an image we're all familiar with of Volodymyr Zelensky having a few days beard, looking quite tired, and of course being dressed in his very typical informal attire. It's a similar slide. I think this appealed to me just because it shows how good he is at relating to people. It shows his body language. It shows he's engaged. and very far from, being a remote leader. These are just pictures showing the contrast with his past. He was evidently in some romantic comedy on the right here, and then in his signature camouflage again. These pictures are, of course, overly familiar to everybody, and that is part of the point of my talk, is the repetitiveness of images, of being exposed to his person. Here we see him with some prominent Western leaders or former leaders, and the contrast is very clear. Here we see him with various Hollywood celebrities, including Sean Penn, Jessica Chastain, and Adam Sandler, I believe, who have all made their way to Kyiv over the last just over a year. Here we have Olena Zelenska, who posed for the First Lady of Ukraine, who posed for a Vogue shoot, Vogue cover that turned out to be quite controversial. In terms of the comments on this, it was controversial in the sense that she participated in the first place, something I will discuss now. But what is interesting about this particular pose is that it led to a movement called #SitLikeAGirl, because she was criticized for her masculine pose here. And yeah, she was told that in some of the Twitter comments, that she should sit in a more feminine manner. Her own view is that she doesn't play up her femininity. And then here, this was actually the Ukrainian edition of Vogue in a different pose. This was British Vogue. It's an interesting picture where she's posing with female soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, but it's still, of course, extremely choreographed. And then something completely different. Here we have the First Lady of Syria, Asma al-Assad. Her husband, of course, is Bashar al-Assad. And she has been called the Desert Rose, or the Rose of Damascus. She's also been called, less flatteringly, Marie Antoinette. And she's, of course, much hated as well. The important thing here is that she was also invited to pose for Vogue. So I'm sort of juxtaposing the two Vogue appearances. But I will go back just for the moment to a slide such as this. Right. In her book regarding the pain of others, Susan Sontag wrote, "Is there an antidote to the perennial seductiveness of war? And is this a question a woman is more likely to pose than a man? Probably yes." Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine of the 24th of February 2022 has been the most broadcasted conflict in history. Over the last 400 days or so, international media networks such as the BBC, Al Jazeera, Sky, and CNN started devoting parts of each news broadcast to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now it can be asked, what are the consequences of such constant, almost incessant broadcasting? And how does this affect public perceptions of the morality or immorality of the Russian invasion? Clearly, the war has generated its own set of aesthetics as the most documented and televised war in history. We have, as the public, various entry points into the conflict. And this set of media and mediated images forms a strong visual narrative, which influences not just legal interpretations, but also political interpretations of the war. But the military and civilian reality in Russia, of course, has not been broadcasted with the same frequency or intensity by the major international Western networks. And I'm actually a former employee of Al Jazeera Media Network, and I actually include Al Jazeera within international media networks, we know that at the start of the conflict, Al Jazeera broadcasted from Moscow quite frequently. This has ceased now, the regularity with which Moscow broadcasts from Moscow. Now, I'm pretty interested in the psychological and other effects of the repetitiveness of these images, what narrative this builds in the mind of the public. I believe it gives meaning to Jim Morrison's saying, whoever controls the media controls the mind. And in this case, the mind of a large part of the world's population. In the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, the media was again in the position of the self-proclaimed producers of the first draft of history. So there can be no question that the media helps produce and write history as well. Ukrainian civilians and politicians, and of course people worldwide, have taken to social networks to document the horrors of the war. And social media has helped Ukrainians internationalize their cause, motivate European countries and the US and others to do whatever they can to support Ukraine. And of course, this is translated into a variety of measures ranging from economic aid, economic sanctions, etc., etc. The provision of weapons, of course. So in my article, in my written article, I will examine not just recurring images of Zelensky and his wife, but I will also look at recurring images of cities in Ukraine, the way in which civilian life in Ukraine is depicted, including the screening of the stories of atrocities, as well as the screening of, for example, artists and musicians playing piano or violin in bombed out apartments, and the impact of these images on the public's perceptions of right and wrong will be analyzed. I will explore the impact of the familiarity and the intensity and the intimacy created by ongoing repetitive screening. It will be argued that repetition cements and reinforces narratives and reduces the ability of the audience to critically scrutinize facts or to imagine differently. This, of course, goes against the popular conventional wisdom that repeated images reinforces truth or reality. I am of the view that it reduces critical thinking. But in the limited time today, I will focus mostly on these sorts of highly choreographed images of Zelensky and his wife, and particularly their clothing. I argue that the sheer volume of images and the repetitive nature of the images had a significant impact on perceptions of the war so far and on the fairness of the conflict. The media images become internalized in people's minds and perceptions, and in some respects become the war. Then I have a heading, War and TV. Here I look at the sort of genesis of war coverage, non-stop 24-hour war coverage by news networks. And of course, the Gulf War is the best example here, because it was precisely Operation Desert Storm, or the Gulf War of 1990 and 1991, involving the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the US-led coalition opposing that really set the scene for this constant, incessant broadcasting, bringing it into people's living rooms hour after hour. And when CNN did this sort of pioneering thing, it was seen as very positive, as revolutionary. It was hardly questioned, and even the Iraqi leadership turned to CNN for news on the Gulf War, which is interestingly reminiscent of the Nazi high command following BBC during the Second World War. So this Gulf crisis was the first major international crisis of the post-Cold War era, and it involved this sort of non-stop display of power by the US specifically. So to me, this raises the question of whether the non-stop display of power, this idea can also be, related to the Ukraine, and one can say that there's an interest in showing the Ukraine as powerful, as never resting, as having this power, and whether displaying power can become power in itself, can start constituting power. This I find an interesting question. We know that the military coverage of the Gulf War was later criticized as being unfree and too highly, and that the US government intervened too much. I'm of the view that even though it might be less subtle, there's also intervention in terms of the coverage of the Ukraine war. The war has also revealed interesting statistics on news consumption. It has thrown a question mark over this idea or the statement that people don't watch TV anymore for news, or that this is not where they get their news from. There's been interesting studies in countries such as Germany and Poland, which suggest that the amount of people following the war on TV is still higher than those following the news on social media, for example. So there's, of course, this argument that the coverage, this is something I will not address directly now, but of course I just want to indicate that I completely sympathize with views that the Ukraine coverage has been, disproportionate in the sense that many conflicts, such as the conflict in Sudan, Ethiopia, Palestine, of course, hasn't received the same amount of coverage, and this is very important, and it's particularly significant in terms of the direct relationship between the amount of media coverage and the amount of political time and resources spent on the Russia-Ukraine war. This means also that media attention has translated directly into political attention. Also, media attention translates into lending credibility to a certain version of the conflict. And in this regard, I draw again on Susan Sontag and her two books regarding the pain of others and on photography. She believes that war imagery is manipulative and make events seem real to the viewers, but she rejects the basic notion that war imagery or constant exposure to war imagery necessarily compels a repudiation of war, because underlying all this coverage, one would imagine that news networks or media people would say, oh, the purpose of it is, it's a sort of to condemn war or to stop war. Sontag's view is that war is perennial. She made this point particularly in the context of the war on terror, but this is something I would like to unpack more in my article. She believes that images are dangerous, constant images of war. She thinks that they are they're superficial and too easily altered. She also thinks that there is something disturbing about viewing horrific images without acting on it. And in this regard, I was very interested in Isabel's paper this morning or earlier today. And, what she said about this idea of looking and viewing. And I think, at some point she said, viewing is an illusory participation. Just this idea that viewing is passive, viewing in itself does not constitute very much. I would like to dig deeper into why people view and the feelings people have when they view, and whether it creates a sort of an international solidarity, pro-Ukrainian solidarity, to what extent that happens. Now, I'm now just moving to the Zelensky effect, what I call the Zelensky effect. Of course, we all know that he's by now created his own brand, that he's been quite a genius in, positioning himself into this sort of global hero, and his media strategy has been very effective. We know that when the Americans offered him and his family a ride earlier last year, He said, "I need ammunition, not a ride." His persona just, radiates that he's patriotic, he'll fight till the bitter end, and that, there is almost no difference anymore between the war, Ukraine, and Zelensky. These have, in some sense, merged. I then have a subheading called "Clothes Maketh the Man." So, of course, his entire appearance wants to illustrate that he's everyman, he's approachable, he's down to earth, he's hands-on, and it's a form of political communication as well. And this has been juxtaposed to Putin wearing particularly expensive clothing. There was one event in March, on 18 March, celebrating the annexation of Ukraine, of Crimea, where Putin wore a $10,000 puffer jacket and a cashmere roll neck sweater under the jacket. And this has been, severely attacked, even by Russians, as, being completely out of touch. Some military generals close to Putin has also displayed the same sort of insensitivity by wearing Prada combat boots. I didn't know that existed, but it exists. So this is really a question of evil versus everyman if you juxtapose Putin with Zelensky, even though I think one should be careful in loosely using that word evil. And then I would like to just briefly talk about Elena Zelenska.
Mia,
Yes?
excuse me, Mia. I just realized that your speaking time is up. So could you please draw your argument to a conclusion, and then we of course have time for discussion later. So if there are other points, we'll be happy to discuss them later.
Sure. Okay. I'm sorry, I haven't been keeping track closely enough. But the point is that as I said, her appearance, on the Vogue cover was highly criticized. It was seen as narcissistic, as creating too much of a brand, and this can be juxtaposed with Asma al-Assad, who was actually initially in 2010, when she was interviewed by Vogue, praised as breezy, conspirational, fun and fashion conscious. The journalist writing the story about Asma al-Assad had to subsequently resign, and the story was taken off the internet, so one cannot even read it at the moment. As The Guardian commented some years later, the article depicted Syria as an Orientalist fantasy of fashion magazines, the land of silk and ruins. So what I am trying to argue eventually is that one can also be critical of Zelensky's military attire. One can also ask questions about whether it is healthy to glorify militarization, whether that is in fact what this is about, the constant military uniforms, whether that points to a sort of a celebration or glorification of war. Of course, on the other hand, one can argue that Ukraine is at war, that Ukraine has been attacked, and that he's simply doing what he can to salvage the situation. And then I would like to just quickly refer to Marina Aksenova's comment yesterday. She said, men like the war part, if I'm correct, that's what she said. And I'm also interested in the extent to which he's projecting a certain image of masculinity by wearing the camouflage gear. And I think I will leave it at that, but I have much more to say, and I hope I can follow up on some of these ideas in my paper. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mia. I'm sure that will be time to discuss this during the Q&A, during the discussion. So now, as the next speaker that we have the pleasure of having as part of this panel prepares, let me try to draw a little bit of a connection. So Mia talked to us about one technological medium, relatively traditional, the TV and the non-stop coverage, as the conveyor of images and the power of those images without necessarily deconstructing. So the image remains legible to the human eye. Now, I think that what Valentin Joitner will do now is try to do something rather different. So Valentin is exploring technology's revelation of international law's aesthetic by retextualizing international law and re-imaging international law thanks to various software applications. Just a couple of words. So Valentin is an associate professor of law at Lund University, and previously he was a research fellow at Oxford University. Pitch is also, well, I encountered his work through his fantastic book from 2017, The Notion of a Legal Dilemma, or it's something like that. Apologies for misquoting it. But Valentin, we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll watch my time very carefully. I have handed out two things. One is the book that I'm going to talk about, book in quotation marks, and it will reach you sooner or later. You can also download a copy in just a second. And a handout which I plan to use, but in light of the size of the room and the number of people, will not refer to extensively, but you can take it home and you can look at it in peace. Before we get started, I had intended to bring along the international law card game, which I created when I was aboard as a PhD student. You said it is an aesthetic engagement with international law, which is maybe less usual. I will not say anything about it except showing you this slide. And if you want to find out more about this international law card game, you can approach me afterwards, and we can fix one for you. I'm hopeful. Okay, Lex Machina. This QR code, I hope, works. If otherwise, you have the paper copy, or you can download it afterwards. Yes, as Tommaso mentioned, I think this is something completely different, and in that sense, wisely put at the very end to, I don't know, lighten up the mood or break up our fatigue from the marathon. What I'm doing in Lex Machina is to experiment with AI software applications and international legal texts. So I'm not in this book, compared to many of the other presentations that we've heard in the last 2 days, I'm not looking at the aesthetics of international law somewhere else, but I'm looking at the aesthetics, or I'm probing the aesthetics, engaging the aesthetics of international legal texts themselves through the lens of AI. And I will tell you how I did this first, and then I will tell you what my own role as an author in quotation marks is in relation to those things. And then at the end, I will try to tell you what I think it could mean, which is always a bit tricky when you talk about your own creative products. But the first step, what happens in Lex Machina? In the book, there are 3 different types of international law texts encounters with technology. I use technology to modify international legal texts. I use technology to create new international legal texts based on existing ones. And I'm using technology to translate texts into something new. And I will give you an example for each one of these so that we know what we're talking about. So the first one is modifications of existing text. What we have here is a page from the Nuremberg Tribunal's proceedings. And what I've done is to use a corpus manager. That's a software that you fill with a lot of text. So I uploaded all of the International Military Tribunal's proceedings into that corpus manager. And then I asked it, what are the the most popular 4-word combinations beginning with I? So this is how it would look like if you do this manually. If you put it in the corpus manager does this for you. And then the result is the first poem creation in the booklet, Sir David Maxwell 5. It's called Sir David Maxwell 5 because the name Sir David Maxwell 5 is actually the most frequent 4-word combination, not beginning with I, but the general 4-word combination in the Nuremberg Tribunal's proceedings. And then I arranged them in order of frequency. So I didn't change anything in terms of the actual original text. I just blanked out everything else. And yeah, what emerges is this. You have the full version also on the handout, and we can think in a moment about what that might mean or what the significance of this is. Then we have creation. So here I said, this was before ChatGPT, at least ChatGPT 3. I downloaded all the contents pages of here, the British Yearbook of International Law from 1976 to 2017. And then I asked the AI to reproduce, to have a go itself at creating journal article names, but also author names. You can see it spotted that there's always a book review section, and the same for EJIL. This is a little bit more interesting maybe here with the replies, unaccountable, a reply to Rosa Friedman. So it kind of, you see a resemblance, or you kind of get what it gets at, but it doesn't quite get it. But this is completely made up. And then the last one, the last category, and as I said, all of this is also online. You can have a look at it in peace later if you like. The last category are translations. So I take texts and I change not just their genre in terms of presentation or by blanking things out, but I'm actually radically transforming. I'm translating it into something else. So here we have The Sound of Non-Liquet. This is actually a quotation from the book, Tommaso, that you conveniently referred to from my dissertation, Irresolvable Norm Conflicts in International Law, where I discuss, among other things, the question of non-liquet. So I recorded the paragraph of the Nuclear Weapons Advisory Opinion that supposedly is a non-liquet declaration. And then I transformed this into sound waves, and then I made the sound waves form a circle and called it the sound of non-liquet. And I'm thinking maybe this communicates something. But what we come to in a moment. Another example, also actually from, this is a coincidence, but also from my dissertation, is to represent this sentence down here: binary distinctions can obscure normative relationships, blah, blah, blah. So I'm taking issue with binary distinctions. And then I thought it could be fun to actually write that critique, express that critique of binary codes in binary code. And the fact that the binary code, so if you put this in a binary code translator, it will actually translate into this text. And the fact that this binary code translator very faithfully translated my critique of binary codes reconciled me a little bit with binary codes to some extent. But we come to the meaning of all of this. And then here, this is more conventional. I recorded, no, not me, Sir Lawrence Oliver recorded the preamble of the United Nations. I remember there was a UN website that when you went onto it, this reading out by this actor would start. I couldn't find it actually again when I searched for it recently, but I thought, let's just visualize this. So those are just the sound waves of that man's recording. So modifications, Sir David Maxwell 5, amongst other things, creations, the journals. I also had it create treaty titles and all kinds of other things, and then translations. So to which extent, this is the second point, can one speak of these things as having been authored by me or not? And that question is quite important, not just for my own reassurance of as the author or non-author, but also when it comes to thinking about what these things mean. When thinking about authorship of these things, I thought it was quite helpful to look at conceptual art, conceptual writing. Has anyone heard of conceptual writing? No, it is the writing equivalent of conceptual art. So you just take an ordinary an ordinary object like a tin can or a phone and say, this is art. And the same has started to happen with texts. I think this Lex Machina thing is one of the few legal texts that do it to that extent, but there have been others in the 20th century. One of them is Reznikov, whom I put here. Mr. Reznikov was a poet and a law clerk, and what he did, he was to take, incidentally, similar material to what I worked with in the Nuremberg cases, from the Eichmann trial. So he took the transcripts from the Eichmann trial and turned them into poetry. I'm mentioning this here in the context of discussing authorship, because you can see here, first of all, that it is him who is presenting or altering the original in this way. But you can also see that he does it in quite a creative, compared to what I'm doing, way. So he changes the line breaks, but he also reorganizes the whole stanza here. That's the original, that's what he has done. What I've done in Lex Machina is only, and this is how it connects to conceptual art, I had an idea and I thought about how I would execute that idea, but I was guided by two main principles, I think. And those were that once I had the idea, so once I selected the text corpus, once I told it, look for I, for instance, or maybe, or I tried love, nothing interesting came up. Or I tried many other text corpora also. Sometimes it just doesn't work. But I tried to have an idea, I tried to give it technical instructions, and then to let the program execute itself and not intervene at all afterwards. Because what I'm going for is to show something about international law. That's the criterion that I used when selecting what I put in the book, because some things were just not meaningful for international law, I think. But I want to show something about international law that is as devoid as my own of my own input as possible. I want it to speak for itself. I don't want to do what Reznikov does, which is, there's nothing wrong with what he does, but it's something different. He poeticizes the trial of Eichmann, which is complicated for all kinds of other reasons. I think he had very good intentions, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to distill something by technological means about international law. What exactly that is, I only started thinking about in preparation for this conference. So the book is from 2020, and I just did it intuitively. I thought, I had the intuition that there's something about this that could be interesting, but I did not at all reflect about it. So and maybe it's also not helpful to reflect too much about it as the one who did it. So I would leave it up to you also to come up with your own views on whether or not this is completely boring, meaningless, strange, odd. It's probably odd, but maybe there's some meaning into it. So I thought just, and with this I come to the end since I only have 4 minutes left. Just 4 things. One thing that all of the Lex Machina texts in quotation marks have in common is that they change the genre, as Isabel mentioned this morning also. They take texts out of a context, or out of the context that we would expect. They don't necessarily change the text. Even the creations are entirely based on what I fed to it. So there's no new material as such in it. But what this means, this change of genre, is that we can see something that is totally familiar to us in a new way. So the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, if you change 2 words of it, or if you don't change anything about it, as a lawyer, I overread it. I don't even read it anymore. The UN Charter Preamble, I don't read it. You see it, it's so ingrained, you don't see it. But when you start translating it, for instance, through, I think, 7, 8 languages, as I did at the end of Lex Machina, it completely changes up the words. It says the same, but in a way that is not familiar, in a way that allows us to see it as if we see it for the first time. And that, I think, is quite an interesting phenomenon, because it allows us to see something about the form and the content of international law that we can only see if we are an international lawyer. So it presupposes a high degree of familiarity, but at the same time, we have to get through or over that familiarity in order to see what it is that we are seeing, if that makes sense. So we can see the form and the structure, the content of international law in a way that we otherwise don't. At least I don't. And I think it's probably similar for many. When we teach international law 101, we have the standard references. We don't really see it in. And I think that's, for example, the value of something like Sir David Maxwell 5. We don't read a page like this in this manner. This doesn't change what is going on here, and I'm sure there's some importance to what's blanked out here. But you could also argue this kind of communicates the essence of what was going on, of the perpetrator's arguments. I didn't know, I didn't mean to, I have no further, and you if you know it, and you have to know it in order for it to make sense, it does not make sense to my parents who are not lawyers. You have to know, of course, that I have no further, probably continues, I have no further comment, I beg your pardon, I'm going to, I think. So it communicates a lot, I think, about this case that is meaningful. Most importantly, and with that I conclude, it reminds us, or it makes visible the agency, counterintuitively, because this is all mechanically constructed, but it makes apparent the human agency, the human creative agency that goes into crafting treaty titles, for instance, that goes into, naming treaty titles, drafting the preamble. It's not God-given, it's not set in stone. Someone thought Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties is a catchy title, and that's why it's called like that. But they will have, someone hopefully thought about this. And these technological experiments make apparent just because, and only because, they are fundamentally mechanical creations. And counterintuitively, that means the human and the human perspective becomes very present, I think. So it's not the case that, which sometimes is now discussed with respect to AI art, for instance, and displaces the human artist. I think the AI that comes in makes the human artist particularly apparent. And it's similar in law. The AI that comes in, mechanizing it, makes the human element so very present. With that, on the 15-minute mark, I finish. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're talking about experiences of displacement, replacement, reshuffling. So one final ingredient in the puzzle that I thought could be worth exploring when we selected the papers is also, well, what about academic discourse itself, right? So in these social media dominated environment that academics in general, international academics in particular, operate. So what is gained, what is lost? What is the production of meaning that these not so new digital media enable and prevent? So Panos, when you want, the floor is yours.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here to present my draft paper preliminarily entitled, International Legal Discourse and Digital Ecosystems Between Sensationalism and Liberation. Let me give you a bit of a brief overview of what the paper is about, what the structure of my presentation today will be as well. So I will first introduce some of the key notions that my paper employs. Discourse communities, communities of practice, international law shaping. I will then briefly list the traditional media of law shaping, the traditional ways in which international law is shaped. I will then move on to this new trend toward the social mediatization of international law shaping. We're moving toward new media, toward digital ecosystems. I will then present a number of opportunities and risks which are entailed in this new trend. And then I will offer concluding remarks. So I'll go very, very briefly through this because it's almost a truism to say that international law is made by governmental actors, but shaped by the invisible College of International Lawyers, in Oscar Schachter's colloquial terms, meaning discourse communities, academics, and communities of practice, lawyers, diplomats, judges, secretaries of tribunals, and so on and so forth. Of course, these two categories overlap greatly. The basic motivation for my paper is the very self-evident proposition that when the medium of expression changes, so does expression itself. The afterthought that I derived from that is that if digital ecosystems change the media of law shaping, then they can change law shaping itself. So the paper asks, how exactly does this happen? How is it that digital ecosystems are actually changing international law shaping. It asks the question and it tries to answer it. So briefly, traditional law shaping media by discourse communities are mainly academic publications, journal articles, books, and so on. In-person academic events, such as the present one. Informal contact between international legal academics and direct stakeholders. And then as far as communities of practice are concerned, specifically when it comes to governmental actors, they shape law through press conferences, through press releases. They directly manifest opinion juris in that way, as well as state practice, or even they can even provide evidence of unilateral declarations. Organizations, both IGOs and NGOs, they present, draft, publish policy papers. They publish internal regulation, which then becomes part of a global administrative practice, so to speak, and then feeds into international law more generally. Then international lawyers, meaning practitioners, they lobby. They also produce academic work to support their own professional agendas, of course, with a veneer of scientific legitimacy. And finally, judges, arbitrators, secretaries, they produce jurisprudence in ways that Tommaso Suave, of course, knows much better than I do. And they shape law in that way. Now, moving on to this new trend, to this social mediatization, as I call it, of international law shaping. Let me identify it first. So law shaping media, the new law shaping media that are used by discourse communities include blogs, social media, mainly Twitter, to some extent also LinkedIn, even Instagram or more hedonic social media platforms, as well as video conferencing platforms. We're moving a little bit toward video conferencing and away from, let's say, presential events, or at least toward hybrid events, such as the present one. And when it comes to law shaping media employed by communities of practice, lawyers like to publish newsletters, so summaries of legal developments of new jurisprudence. And what that does is just to showcase the firm's expertise in a given topic and to advertise the firm. It happens quite a bit in ISDS, but not only. They also publish, we also publish client alerts. These are emails that are sent to existing clients mostly, but also announcements on the website of the firm, or even on LinkedIn, where you identify a given measure and you tell basically potential clients, here's something that might affect your interests. We can help. We can help with that. And then international organizations are also increasingly exploring digital ecosystems, and they're making particular use of social media and video conferencing platforms. Here you see, for instance, a little bit of a screenshot from the ICRC's TikTok page. The ICRC is here explaining how it promotes international and humanitarian law, and it is doing so in an interactive way on TikTok. And the WHO does the same thing quite often. And then governments, as far as governments are concerned, they're engaging increasingly in diplomacy, as international relations scholars call it nowadays. And this is an example from the government of Israel's official Twitter account, where they're asking ordinary citizens to pose questions. And some of the citizens, of course, pose questions that you can qualify as provocative, or at least as thought-provoking. Here, there's a question by David: why can't Israel get along with Palestinians? Israel replies, and that is, mind you, it's actually Israel. It's Israel's official governmental account on Twitter. Why can't the Palestinians get along with Israel? That sort of bizarre exchange is actually an expression of state will. It's a tweet from an official governmental account. It can provide evidence of state practice, opinion juris. It could be a unilateral declaration. And at least one adjudicatory body, and that's the WTO panel in Saudi Arabia intellectual property rights, had recourse to tweets, actually, in its reasoning. And it said that under general international law principles of state responsibility, actions at all levels of government are attributable to the state. And you see some of the tweets on which it relied on the screen. One of those tweets is by the Council for the Saudi Royal Courts, and the tweet includes hashtag blocking Qatari be in sport. That is evidence of state practice. Or even of state intent in the sense of a unilateral declaration of intent. Now let's move on to the chase. What are the opportunities and what are the risks for discourse communities first, before I move on to practice communities? That are presented by this new trend, by the digitalization or the advent of digital ecosystems. So coming first, starting with the opportunities, I put all of these opportunities under the umbrella catch-all term of liberation. So what digital ecosystems do is they enhance the more readily apparent thing that they do is that they enhance technical or economic accessibility because they have a preference for open access policies. But they also enhance intellectual accessibility because the publications that they usually feature are of a limited length, and they have an informal writing style, or at least an informalized writing style. They also enhance inclusivity because the informality and the limited length that I just mentioned, these features, they encourage publications by non-native English speakers and by young scholars. And then the simplicity and the disintermediation of the reviewing process is also an important opportunity that it offers. And it, again, enhances inclusivity. Even where you have a semi-formalized review process, as is the case maybe of the biggest of the most well-known blogs, even when you have that, there is still a sort of unwritten convention that younger and marginalized voices must be afforded the same or at least a similar standing as that of established academics. So maybe today, George Abisab writes a post on a Jill Talk. Tomorrow it's me, Panagiotis Kyriakou, writing it. So there's a lot of fluctuation in terms of the seniority of the people who write in these types of media. These types of media also reduce entry barriers. They provide an opportunity for young scholars to test their hypotheses in a cozy intellectual environment, devoid of the, let's say, quasi-ritualistic and démodé formalities of journals and books. And they also improve the aesthetic features of the production of intellectual work because they offer better interactive features. They offer hyperlinks, images, reply submissions, reply comments, retweets. Now, of course, that also happens in journals in a sense. You can also hyperlink something in a journal. You can also have a reply submission in a journal. You can also have images in the journal. But what typically happens is that all of that is is dry in a sense because the images are restricted to tables, to graphs. Hyperlinks are restricted to maybe judgments or other publications or IMF reports or what have you. And reply submissions take time. So they're not exactly responsive. Another opportunity is the fact that digital ecosystems humanize academic production by normalizing emotion sharing and connecting academics with the public. Britton, Jackson, and Wade state in that regard that academics can now vent frustrations, share personal victories and setbacks, and seek out role models and voices who may otherwise be hidden or not heard. Academics using social media also, that's just an insight from that same article, which is an empirically grounded one. It's based on actual research, empirical research carried out by some other academics. So academics using social media to share selfies, for instance, they're perceived as warmer, more trustworthy, and no less competent than their non-selfie sharing colleagues. Tomas, I have an example from your tweets here. Putting a little bit on the spotlight. That's a very nice post, by the way. It's a very nice post. It's a very warm, inviting post. Tommaso is here basically, let's say, advertising his publication. He's advertising his book, The Everyday Makers of International Law, which I need to buy, by the way. I really need to buy. And he's saying that you should buy it because you might like it. Fair enough. But also because it can double as a sturdy, if a bit expensive, beer mat.
More than a bit.
So another tweet is so that puts Tommaso in a good light. I mean, he now is somebody who is approachable, somebody who has more to offer than a dry academic dialogue, and that is nice. And apparently, studies suggest that it's effective as well in terms of transmitting your message to the public. I think it's the final opportunity that the social mediatization offers, or advantage that it has, is that it is specific to video conferencing platforms. Video conferencing platforms, what they do is, to some degree, is they add transparency to the process of socializing in an academic context. And I know that's not a word, but please bear with me, accept it for the purpose of this presentation. They de-lobbyify academia. So what I mean by that is that they offer a partial disconnection of academics from interest groups, and that allows more focus on genuine intellectual production. Let me be a bit more specific. What often happens in conferences where you have state actors mingling with academics is a lot of side lobbying. That feature, which is endemic and specific to presential events, it's a physical side feature of events, is absent, or at least not that much present in these types, or in hybrid, and certainly not in video conferencing events. Let's move on now to the risks. Again, for discourse communities, I will move in a bit to practice communities. The risks, I put them under the umbrella of sensationalism. Britton, Jackson, and Wade note in that sense that social media increases the sharing of ideas, and the faster and cross-cultural aspect of these interactions means that people may see more content that causes individual moral outrage. It definitely happens to me. And so that, as a result, discourse becomes adversarial, or there is a risk of discourse becoming adversarial. There's an absence of filters, which then facilitates criticism that often flirts with lack of civility, or actually lacks civility altogether. You have ad personam attacks, and I've seen quite a few, and that's actually the reason why I no longer have Twitter, because I've seen things that I just did not like. Lupton notes that by engaging in academic commentary on social media, we risk inflaming sensitivities or appearing unprofessional by providing too much personal detail. There's, of course, the opposite end of the spectrum, which I depicted earlier. And then Stan and Debrabander, they note that since digital ecosystems are designed to place emphasis on marketing features, they can enhance egocentricity. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of egocentricity out there on social media. And Lupton again notes that recipients of our work may perceive our personality as overly entrepreneurial or self-aggrandizing, and therefore discard our work outright without even reading it. It goes back to egocentricity. Here I have two examples of posts or articles which are quite daring, I will say. I am not passing judgment on them. I'm not some sort of Puritanist, but they're quite daring. And what I want to show with these posts is that they were accepted. They're interesting. They were published. I'm not 100% sure that these types of posts would have passed the filtering of traditional law shaping media. Now, what that does is it puts these authors, it exposes them to certain risks, but these authors are willing to take the risk, right? They are willing to publish that. They have seen that they have gone through their publications. They have decided these are good titles, and their blogs accepted these titles. They place themselves in this sort of risky situation, but that is how these new types of law shaping media work. I think the most important risk of digital ecosystem is the echo chamber effect. So our opinions resonate quite strongly within circles of like-minded members of discourse communities because of algorithmic configurations, because of other reasons, such as manual exclusion tools. We can unfollow somebody, we can just we can silence somebody. And what that ends up doing is that it gives us a false sense of validation and empowerment, which then pushes us toward counterproductive intellectual directions. Again, these are risks. I'm not saying it always happens, but these are risks. And then there are two features which are positive, but linked to risks, which are brevity and spontaneity. What that does is it might allow you to publish something that lacks in-depth research and cross-validation. Then when that publication is debunked or challenged publicly, that public exposure may result in implausible and intellectually dishonest attempts to defend your original proposition. So that you have a deep intellectual problem there. You're not being honest. You're just trying to defend yourself because you were publicly exposed, but you took the risk of publishing something without a lot of reflection. And you did that because of the spatial configurations, the illusion of safe space that these types of media provide. I think this is a final risk. Accessibility and inclusivity, which are opportunities that I presented earlier, they may actually be overstated. And that's because you will end up inevitably having new exclusory power centers, just like you have them with regular publication venues. I think it's already happening. And you have an indirect form of exclusion, which is the fact that social media requires performative skills, which not everybody has, self-promotion skills. Not everybody is very comfortable with these types of ventures. Then in terms of communities of practice, I don't see any clearly identifiable advantages of social mediatization. There is one that, in a sense, these media give a voice to a wider pool of states. So you have more genuine globalization of international law, but I think it's a long shot. I don't think it's really happening. It's really helping in that way. On the other hand, there are a lot of risks for states. I think that the informal tone that they sometimes adopt in these types of posts on social media, on social media, leads to a heightened risk of misinterpretation by the recipients of these statements. And then when it comes to lawyers, the constant production of client alerts and newsletters and their participation in online discourse communities, and I think I'm guilty as charged here, leads to conflation of professional agendas and academia. And that, then, which in turn might lead to law shaping being more easily infiltrated by power. So to conclude, in terms of discourse communities, I would just echo the conclusion of Stan and Deborah Bandere, which was given 10 years ago. It still holds true today, in my opinion, in their article titled The Future of International Legal Scholarship. They offered what they call not a conclusion. What they said was that academics should apply greater vigilance, self-restriction, and care in the production of scholarship, and greater filtering in the selection of publications. And I agree with that. I think that we can't really fight technology. It's a losing battle. Social mediatization is here to stay. Blogs are here to stay. In fact, if I wanted to actively advocate against blogs, I think the best way to do it, the most effective way to do it would be through blogs, which tells you all you need to know about the degree of infiltration. So what I'm proposing is a market-based response in a sense. It's awareness by us, by the supply side of academic knowledge, about the limits of these types of publication venues and about their potential risks. And so, more careful and measured use. And finally, when it comes to communities of practice, I think I already explained that the advantages are really overstated. The one advantage which exists is overstated. When it comes to lawyers, so we should not adopt them altogether. That's my solution. We should not have states tweaking. When it comes to lawyers, I think that we should think about what are the possible ways that in which we can identify and bust fake academia by lawyers. And then I think blogs themselves have a huge responsibility. I think that blogs which feature regular contributions by legal practitioners, they know who they are, must carefully filter position papers which are disguised as academic papers, which are really client-based. And so my final proposition, I see you, Tommaso, I know that I'm running out of time. Well, I'm actually exceeding time. My proposition is let's open a dialogue. I'm a full-time lawyer and I'm really willing to have that dialogue with academics. Maybe the Q&A might be one way to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Panos. Actually, thank you very much, Panagiotis Kyriakou. I made a big oversight and I didn't introduce you. And I think that your double affiliation as a researcher and doctoral researcher, now done, I understand, at the Grado Institute in Geneva as a practicing lawyer at Archipel, I think it was reflected very nicely in this duality. So I think that thank you and apologies for this oversight. All right, this draws the presentations to a close. I'm looking at the audience. I know it's been a very long day, but I'm sure that there will be some questions for our panelists. I certainly have some, but floor is open first. Late Saturday evening. Caroline.
Hi, I have a question for you. Very interesting presentation. I find the social media effect very interesting, exciting to research. But did you encounter any research that covers the negative impact of social media on mental health or performance? Because you talked about egocentricity. You also talked about people not feeling comfortable in social media. And I think those two are linked to mental health. So I would be just interested about the overproduction and you always feeling that you're not doing enough. Thank you.
Silvia.
Maybe just I found them really fascinating papers. Some of them have also, I think the photography, we discussed it yesterday to a certain extent. And I think the question again here is agency in that sense. So we have to differentiate quite clearly if someone speaks as an academic, if someone speaks as a president in times of war. If someone speaks as courts, for example, also on social media, it's what I was looking, for example, in Germany, we have quite a big debate on public officials on social media. Can they use their private accounts? No, we all know the Trump debate. What about court? What about the police? What can they tweet? All of the things, of course, is problematic. In international organizations, we don't usually have that. So what type of responsibility or accountability do we have for public organizations on
all types of field. And I think there's a difference between what Mia was talking about and what we were talking about in the last thing. I think what Valentin is doing is great. I have no questions on that. Just want to highlight that. But maybe to the last speaker, okay, I feel a bit called out. I'm a social media exhibitionist. I was asked to give talks how to use Twitter as an academic, which I find incredibly weird. I never did it, but I think what we're missing also when we're discussing that, and I really like the two posters you had on the blog post. So those masturbation and bullshit and lies, those were not usual tweeters. This was Jean d'Apremont, which basically just tweets Jean d'Apremot's publications, and Fouad Sabiev, which doesn't even have Twitter. So in that sense, the people that tweet are not the people that want to shock everyone, which are like established law professors. So in that sense, I would be very careful to not conflate those two communities, or if they're actually the same community. And I would be really interested to see, when we're looking at academic social media, whether we have a sociologist of the tweeters, because I feel at the moment, and I'm of course also biased, it's very often female people as people with care responsibility who are at home, who can't go to the conferences in that sense. So in that sense, I don't want to underestimate the risks, and all of those things of course have a gendered impact, but I'm also a bit careful about being generalistic about certain aspects, because we're missing a lot of disadvantages that might not be that clear on the tweeting College of International Lawyers here. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia. Any other questions? Yes, to see Marius.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for the presentations. I want to add a little bit that what Twitter really changed, and for me it really changed, that you put a face on what you read. I remember when I started in trade law, I think I didn't know any of the faces of, I don't know, the appellate body members of one of the most famous writers until I saw them in person in an event or something like this. While right now, probably you know someone from his face before you actually read him. And this radically changes on how you perceive a reading. And that's a question I want to Panos, is from the readings you have done, whether there is actual any correlation or any actual empirical data on how this changed the way we refer to or the way we cite. And also to make this link is many times we know that certain agendas or certain research projects are taken by particular groups or particular nationality, particular culture and everything, whether this is exacerbated even further, because you already know, because it's so easily and readily available, that, okay, that person is of that culture, of that position, so I know what he's going to write, or he, she. Thank you.
Yeah, that's attention bias, and it's not reasonable research. No? Just personal experience, there isn't like.
Thank you. Unless there are other hands up, Camille.
Thank you. I have a question to our colleague from the university famous of Wild Strawberries, if you remember the famous Bergman movie. I mean, the University of Lund. And I'm really impressed with the book we have in our hands. However, we as boring lawyers always should about the impact. So the question is, what is your next step you are going to do? Because I'm impressed as a philosopher of law. I'm really impressed. But is it a game or is it something important? So what you will bring us? What will be this additional value of this kind of research? Thank you.
Okay, I do have one quick question for Mia and one quick question for Oana. So Mia, you focused your presentation on two specific wars, the wars in Ukraine, and then you referred also to the situation in Syria through the use of pictures, and you say, well, these are, especially the war in Ukraine, is the most televised and media covered war in history. How is that changing? So is that, it's a matter of quantity of the coverage that we are getting that is altering our perceptions? Is that something inherent in the photographic medium? So does quantity turn into a qualitative difference in what we are seeing compared to situations that you might have studied in the past? And to Oana, so I like, so this is more a comment. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this. So aesthetics as well, the reaction, so the antidote to kind of the sleepiness that rely only on data and processes can induce in lawyers. What type of aesthetic should we deploy? What type of images would kind of wake us up from our torpor when we are dealing with those specific instances in adjudication? I think one last, and then.
I mean, this is mostly to the first presentation, but I think it applies more generally, is the question of not just consumption, but the site of consumption. So I think previously, for example, even with legal text, one would consume the legal text in a law library, in the library of the court. But when it comes to nowadays, these texts are available more readily anywhere. Likewise with, say, advertisements for a conference or a book, it would be in a university previously, and now it's on Twitter, it's on your phone. I was thinking about the photographs because I think one question is the quantity, but also is where you're consuming the photographs. There are two exhibitions on Ukraine, the photographs from Ukraine that I'm thinking about. There's one, I think it was in Albertina in Vienna, where they were compared with the photographs of Goya, not photographs, the paintings of Goya. So those are consumed in a specific place. They're paintings, so they can't be consumed on your phone. You have to go to an exhibition to consume those, to view those photos. Whereas photographs of Ukraine have been, exhibited all over the place. You see them online. I was thinking about an exhibition which was actually there in the university in CEU, when graduation was taking place last year. There were photographs which were put up, and the reaction to those photographs was very interesting because there was food in that same sort of place, and the reaction by colleagues who were Ukrainian and other colleagues was very different. So I was wondering how the site of consumption matters when it comes to digital media, whether that also has an impact on how it changes the perception of war, in addition to the question of quantity.
Thank you, Roy. I think we have a lot of food for thought. Maybe starting with Mia, let's do the round from you. I would ask the speakers to keep their answers relatively brief because time is tight. Mia, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you for those questions. So, Tomaso, I think that the constant bombardment, no pun intended, of images, of war images, in terms of Ukraine, has certainly fixed certain ideas in people's minds, which is now almost impossible to alter. So this shows the incredible interest of the media, and I think that power of the media, and I think that the interests behind that kind of media coverage should be probed much more deeply. It cannot be taken for granted that some wars should get this extreme amount of coverage and some wars hardly any coverage. My argument is kind of weakened, I guess, by this question of international law consensus around the illegality of the war. That there's an incredible sort of consensus around some of the major issues around the war. But I think this issue of consensus is also very interesting because this is also, without stretching out my answer any longer, this is something Susan Sontag also looks at the creation of consensus. And I think that in terms of this war, there is more consensus than I've ever seen on any war. And it sometimes troubles me, the extent to which consensus and agreement has been fixed. And then just in terms of the other question about the site of consumption, I would say, again, that there's not enough difference of opinion worldwide in terms of certainly the Ukrainian war. It seems almost unhealthy, the level of agreement. But certainly, I'm sure if you watch this from Ukraine or watch this from Russia or Belarus or a country that is intimately involved, this would change your perspective. But I still think there's an unhealthy amount of consensus. And I just wanted to mention, someone had a hand up here online, because I think the organizers don't always see the questions coming from online participants.
Thank you, Mia. Valentin, would you like to? So he had the so what question.
Yes. Thank you very much for the question. The question was, what's the next step? What's the point in some way? And is it a game, or is it important, or that's what follows from it, right? And I think it can be both a game and it can be important. What I would hope follows from it, for example, in teaching, also when I engage with practicing international lawyers, is an awareness that the system is human made, and not just human made, but it is constantly reinforced by who we are. And I think it's not a coincidence that I made this book while I was in the employ of the German government. And I was quite frustrated by the way in which I was in the central chancellery, so quite close to the heart of power. And I was very frustrated by the lack of awareness of individual agency in these centers of power. And I think that's very similar to us lawyers. We have a lot of choice, we have a lot of discretion in terms of what kind of arguments we make, of what kind of causes we dedicate us to. So I think in principle it is fine and it has merit without any impact. But if it has an impact, then I would hope that it can hammer home that we are constantly making the system. So I think that would be my attempt at an answer. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm looking at Oana. Thank you, Oana. And last but not least, Panagiotis.
Thank you, Tommaso. Panos.
Yes.
Panos.
Well, I did introduce you earlier, so it needs to be formal now.
So the question of mental health, I'm not aware of any studies. It's an issue I discussed with my sister, who is a psychologist, and I decided not to include it because I don't want to touch upon that kind of stuff without being fully informed. And I think I will in the final version of the paper after I do proper research, because these are not things I think we should be discussing lightly in a context such as this one. Instinctively, I would definitely say that some of the risks that I mentioned, of course, they can have mental health impact. Severe, in fact, if the discourse is adversarial, if you have individual moral outrage, if you don't get enough likes, retweets, criticism that is too harsh. Again, all these things are not specific to social media. There is more space for them to happen, and we should just be aware of that. You had a number of comments which I would like to discuss later. I think we can have more dialogue in it, under less time pressure. But there's one thing I'd like to react to, which is this notion that Twitter and blog posts are not the same, which I agree 100%. They're not the same, and they have different features and design features, and that conditions also what you say, who says it, and so on and so forth. But I think the features that I mentioned are actually quite common: the brevity, informality, the interactivity, that they're prone to egocentricity. That happens a bit more in Twitter than on blogs, but even in blogs, because you can produce a lot and you can say things you wouldn't otherwise say, I think. The lack of a need for in-depth research. And that's actually why I didn't include a tweet that shocks, but I included two blog posts or titles that might shock, because I would just want to show that even in blog posts, which are a bit more formalized and a little bit more constrained in terms of the language, it's not your space, it's more public space. Even there, you can have such risks. The suggestion that if I got it correctly, that social media or blogging favors production by women, or if that's a suggestion, I'd like to discuss it. I think it's pretty interesting. If you have some more thoughts on that, I'd love to have a dialogue. And finally, on the question posed by Marios on this issue of putting a face to the people that you quote or that you intellectually interact with, but not personally interact with. So you're asking if there's any empirical study that shows how putting a face has actually maybe quantitatively affected how much we cite people, how much we acknowledge people, how much. Not to my knowledge. There might be. It's an interesting project. But I mean, there are self-declaration based studies which show that that would tend to be the case, that you will think that you I mean, you already know what that person is like. Maybe you know their political views. That's a leftist academic. That's a right-wing academic. It certainly happens in economics, and I'm sure it happens in law as well. The insight I have is about academia in general, not specific to law, but I would imagine it applies to law as well. So there's a preconception that. So there are studies, but not specific as much as you would want them to be. But we should also be mindful of the positive features of this putting a face, on people. Yeah, I think I actually discussed the positive features. So that concludes my answer.
Thank you, Panos. And please join me in thanking the whole panel for, I think, a very interesting concluding session. And now, as I promised, my closing remarks will take a full 28 minutes, if that's okay with you. Of course, I'm joking. I just want to thank everyone for a fantastic 2 days. We know that the program was really packed, and so, well, learning experience. It was very important for us as Central European University, as EASL Interest Group, to try and start this conversation. We consider this the beginning, hopefully, of a conversation. And of course, we will hear from us. We'll try to continue this conversation also and make something out of the fantastic ideas that you shared with your papers and presentations. Just stay tuned. We will reach out to all of you. The one thing that I want to highlight that maybe went a little unnoticed is how playful we were with the aesthetics of an academic conference, almost unwittingly. So that was something surprising for me. We had, well, already kind of a living room type of setting and not the typical bench. We had, well, the hybrid model that is now common, but we had chairs being moved, Olivia going around the room. We had singing. We had videos being streamed. We had playful experimentations from Valentin just a moment ago, just to cite a few examples. And I think that there is an inherent value in trying these new forms. So I'm happy that these happened quite spontaneously. Just to finish, yet last night, Philip made fun of me and said, well, he always wrote, see you soon, Tomas, on behalf of the conveners, as if I were the only person who somehow worked on this conference. Well, that is not true. I should acknowledge just the people who make this possible, starting with our wonderful moderators, Lorenzo Gasbarri, Silvia Steininger, Inga Winkler, Carolina Bertazzoli, and Roy Sharma, who really did a lot of work reading the papers and leading the discussion. Then this would not have happened without the very hard work that Darren Seifert, Kate Katlina, Anna Javor, and Tunde Sabo put into it. And well, thanks to all of you for putting this, and especially thanks to our wonderful panelists and keynote speakers for, of course, breathing life into these proceedings. Enjoy Vienna. Have a good evening. Thank you so much.